of restoration at Beaver Trust, a charity working to restore beavers, to regenerate our landscapes, and who provide practical solutions to help people live alongside beavers. This evening, we'll be discussing beaver ecology and behaviour, their impact on the landscape, and what this means for farmers and land managers. Before we dive into that, I'll just give a quick introduction to FWAG East. So we are a farmer-led organisation delivering independent advice on everything to do with farm conservation, soil health, water quality and resource protection, agri-environment scheme funding, farm ecology surveys, net gain, and much more. We deliver landscape and catchment scale projects, facilitate farmer clusters, and run training workshops and events just like this for our members. If you haven't already joined our farmer membership, head over to our website to browse the benefits of doing so. So without any further ado, I'll pass you over to Roisin to tell us all about beavers. You might have seen on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got a Q&A feature. So if you've got any questions during the talk, just pop them into that Q&A chat, and we'll go through them all at the end, as well as any other questions you might have. Okay, over to you, Roisin.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I'll just do the technical part. Please let me know if this works. Can you
Perfect.
see?
Yeah.
Oh, phew.
That's
right,
it.
good.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
Thanks very much, and thanks for everyone for joining. I really appreciate you giving up your time, especially in the evening. So hopefully I'll talk about beavers, kind of the most up-to-date situation, a bit about licensing. We're going to cover some of the challenges also living with beavers, but hopefully I can convince you in some ways of some of their ecological and biodiversity benefits. And then if there's any questions at the end, I'll do my best to try and answer them. So just to introduce us, we're the Beaver Trust. We've been in existence for a few years now. We've got about 15 of us spread over Britain. So I'm based up in Scotland with one of the largest wild beaver populations. But like I say, we've got teams all over. We're kind of divided into the restoration team, which I head up, but we've got a big education and comms team as well. So basically, just as kind of Lucy described, we're hoping to kind of facilitate this transition of this new species coming back to our countrysides, deliver practical mitigation, and just really help educate people as best we can to try and see how do we re-establish living with this species again. So it might be a very stupid question that we'll all start with, but what is a beaver? What we're finding is there's lots of ideas of what beavers are, or maybe some preconceived conceptions, but this is a species that's outside our living memory in Britain. It's estimated it's probably disappeared about 400 years ago, so sometimes we have to introduce the species. What I will say, it's not this. A big caveat at the start. And it's funny how many times this species appears when people talk about beavers. So this is a coypu, as probably many of you will see. This is a South American rodent, which is a non-native, but is often confused, especially in pictures, for beaver. Now, in your area, I guess it was about 1920s, the coypu was released, especially in kind of fur farming. So East Anglia especially had quite large numbers of this non-native, and there was a lot of effort to eradicate this species. So sometimes there's a bit of an overlap or maybe potential confusion between beavers and coypu. So we're not bringing back this species. Now, why I say that, it may be quite obvious the difference between them, but still there's some amazing things that still get on social media, confusing some of these species. So obviously very embarrassing for Nature Scots, and it was quickly taken down, I must say, but one of their reports a few years back actually had an otter on the front, so that was definitely not a beaver. More recently, and it's not naming or shaming, but it's just to say a lot of the pictures you might see in some of the press are not actually beavers, they're coypu. So some of the kind of distinguishing features are, I think, but these very predominant white whiskers. But when you just see a kind of semi-aquatic mammal in the water and just see the head, it's quite easy to kind of confuse them. So there's no plans to bring coypus to Britain whatsoever. Now, I would say beavers are really quite a fascinating species. I would say that. I'm a bit biased. But what we have is this kind of semi-aquatic animal that's kind of halfway adapted to life in water, halfway adapted to life on the land, and maybe a bit clumsy in both of them. But they've got some really cool features to, facilitate their life in the water. So the first thing you'll see with beavers are they've got this really, really thick fur. It's one of the thickest fur in the animal kingdom. And this really was a bit of their downfall as well. But that's really to keep them warm. They spend a lot of time in water, and they keep this fur in pristine condition. The bottom left picture there is their grooming claws, a specialized claw they've got in their back hind webbed feet, to really comb all the dirt and kind of grit out of their fur. So it remains full of air so they can be quite buoyant, but also trap a layer of kind of heat around them. You can see if they're diving or swimming underwater, they are quite adapted. They're like a little bullet. Now, they're not as agile as an otter or anything like that, but they've got these big, powerful, webbed hind feet. There's a lot of the drive for their swimming power. And they do kind of float on the surface, they've got all their sense organs high in the head. So actually for such a big animal, they can be quite discreet and hard to see. So you really have to kind of get your eyes in because they can be quite secretive as well. And then we look at their life on the land. So beavers are really tied to this kind of riparian shoreline interface between water and land. So they have to come out onto land. They obviously sleep on land, in burrows or lodges, but they spend loads of time foraging. But they do feel safest in the water, so that's why you'll see them grab food, kind of waddle back and eat it along the shoreline. So they're not the fastest of sprinters. They can go short distances, but basically they kind of waddle along as a kind of bit more cumbersome on four legs. If you're lucky, you can see them waddle for very short distance on their back two legs, and that's usually if they're carrying like mud or sometimes even their babies, but they're basically adapted for all four legs. And then they've got this very unique tail, which has a really specialized function. Not that you would, but if you were to slice a beaver tail in half, you can see it's actually a lot of blubber. So it's where they store their fat. So that's when we're looking at beaver body condition, we see what condition their tail is, because that tells us how much fat and what, a good story, or yeah, what good condition they're in or not. So again, it's quite a unique idea and feature. But like I say, often when you see a beaver, it's a bit of a tiny head in the distance. Now, beavers are really social animals, but the importance in this, they're only social within their own kind of family unit. So they live in family units that's based around a breeding adult pair and then all their offspring. Now, beavers are actually quite slow breeders, so the offspring stay at home for 2 years before they kind of go off on their way. So if you think about other rodent species, that's actually quite a long time delay. So like I say, you see lovely social behaviors between them, lots of mutual grooming. They will kind of make vocalizations to each other. They'll all snuggle up, and they'll defend their territory together. So another key behavior with beavers are they're highly, highly territorial between these family units. So if you ever have or see a beaver pelt, if you flip it over, you can see often on bigger animals all these half moon scarring shapes, and that's attacks from other beavers. So they can be really quite vicious to each other. And you can see in higher population densities, often chunks and nicks start emerging in their tails. And that gives you a good indication of what the beaver kind of density is in that area, because it can be quite vicious and attack each other, especially around the flank. Now, from a human point of view, this kind of gives us unique like identifying features that can be picked up on camera traps and things like that. So very friendly, social with each other, not so friendly between families. And this is important because this allows us to influence some of mitigation, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. Now, beavers will, like I say, form these kind of mostly monogamous pairs and then have 2 generations of offspring within a family unit. So they breed once a year. They only have 1 litter a year. So again, compared to other rodent species, they're actually quite slow breeders. The average litter size is about 2 to 4 animals or kits per year. So we can see, a small beaver can be quite vulnerable. So actually we are seeing predation pressure on kits. We've had otter, badgers, people's dogs, even foxes will predate on beaver kits. But basically, once they get to about 2 years of age and nearly adult growth, there's probably very little that will take on a beaver predator-wise. Obviously, in Britain, we don't have wolves or bears that can influence predation in other parts of Europe. So mortality wise, we're kind of seeing they can be fairly long lived. So on average, usually about kind of 12 to 15 years is the kind of average lifespan. Like I say, once you get past your kit phase, you're pretty robust. But the biggest kind of driver of beaver mortality, especially at higher densities, is actually other beavers. Like I mentioned, they're pretty vicious to each other. One family has to maintain, quite a big territory really to make sure they have enough food. So when we're talking about beaver kind of territory size, it can be in the kilometers, but that really does depend on, the habitat quality, for example. So on average, a beaver territory size can be about 3 kilometers of bank or shore length. Obviously, like, other mammal populations, they can be subject to disease, parasite loads. But again, we're really not seeing that. We've tested over, I guess, 350 beavers across Britain. We're not seeing high disease rates, but, that's a monitoring situation that we'll just kind of keep on monitoring as the years go on. We are seeing adults are being hit in certain areas by traffic, which is kind of usual for most species. And obviously in some parts we can see lethal control and culling is having a bit of an impact as well. But otherwise, quite a long-lived animal. The record in captivity for beavers is over 20 years. So yeah, they're fairly robust. Now, why are we talking about it? Well, we know it's a British native that was brought to extinction in Britain by human activities. Now, marked in red here is the European distribution of the Eurasian beaver. There's 2 species alive today, but we're only focusing on the Eurasian beaver. The other one is the North American beaver. So in Europe, basically every freshwater system, apart from, there's no evidence we can see of them ever being in Ireland and some of the very, very southern parts of Europe. But this distribution goes right the way across, Russia, into China and Mongolia. So this really is a kind of Northern Hemisphere dominant species. There's a really brilliant book, if you ever get to see it, by Bryony Coles, which is Beavers in Britain's Past. Now, Bryony is an archaeologist by training. So she's created all these kind of lovely maps. She's done lots of work in Wales, especially, to really try and capture some of the historic background to beavers in Britain. And as you can see, it's fairly well distributed over the country. But she's collated things like church records, place names, physical evidence of beavers, such as fossil bones or even gnawed trees that have been preserved. So she's kind of really detailed. And we can see this was quite a common species actually throughout our freshwater systems. Now, why did they disappear? Well, like many things, the beaver was very useful to humans. So there really was this kind of drive. It was a big, useful animal, lots of meat on it. If you kind of wanted to butcher a beaver, there's probably similar meat to a dressed roe deer. But beavers, obviously this fur, keep on mentioning, that really was a downfall of beavers. And there was huge kind of fashions for beaver hats. I mean, that really was where most of the beavers went. So once the Europeans pretty much got rid of them across most of Europe, then they traveled over to kind of Canada and North America, and a lot of the fur trade routes that were kind of opened up was based on this trade in beaver fur because it was so valuable. Also, there's almost other byproducts. So beavers produce 2 scents. One of them is castoreum, which they're really quite famous for. And as humans, we thought, lots of medical purposes. So you can trace right back to kind of ancient Greek and Roman days of using castoreum for medicinal, often pain relief. And it was said to cure everything from kind of toothache to hysterical women, whatever they are, and that's how it's described. But also it was used as a base for perfume as well. So basically a very valuable animal and commodity used. So again, just focusing on the European distribution, really by the end of the late 19th century, this was almost a species that was globally extinct. They were hunted right down to a few relic populations that are marked in yellow there. So Norway always had a kind of small population of beavers. There's some remnants in France and into Belarus and stuff. So again, we nearly lost this species completely. So it's estimated that today's population is coming back from about just over 1,000 individuals. So why are we here talking about reintroducing beavers? Well, there's been definitely in the last 20 years a big drive to see this species back for various reasons. So depending on your kind of outlook, People believe, well, it was our native species. There's lots of evidence of it being here for a long time. So is there some ethical kind of obligation to reinstore it? There's been lots of consultations, really starting in the early 2000s, and overall, there's a big public desire, mostly positive, to see this species back. But I guess why we get more interested in beavers is because they're really recognized as this keystone species, drivers of biodiversity, habitat creation, especially among our wetlands, which we've pretty much kind of lost over a large percentage of our country as well. We can see that beavers are drivers of ecological services. So we think about water quality improvement, sediment retention, if we allow them to be beavers and kind of carry out beaver activities. I was going to say, back in the day, again, early 2000s, there was also a bit of a kind of political, drive that certain EU member states had to investigate bringing certain species back. Now, that doesn't mean they were obligated, but you had to do kind of feasibility studies. So you'll see, Nature Scott, Natural England started investigating the feasibility of bringing this species back again about the early 2000s. So lots of publications in and around that time. Now, there's so much kind of science being generated now. Beavers really are the kind of the buzzword and topic for investigation. So if you wanted to read more, and I'm hopefully going to give you a bit of examples, this really is an excellent summary paper, really just saying, how this species acts on our landscapes and, like I say, earns its title as an ecological kind of engineer. So there's, lots of kind of variations or studies on this, but if we kind of condense it down in summary, this is how beavers can be drivers of landscape changes and how as humans, we can potentially benefit from some of these as well. So, we can see things like water storage in action, improving water quality, drivers of increased biodiversity where kind of beavers turn up. So for example, there's lovely studies going on in Devon, how beaver created habitats are then really having this knock-on effect on water voles, creating all this habitat. So you can see kind of peak almost population explosions and water voles as well associated with beavers. But there's lots of other subtle interactions, increases in plant diversity, for example, where beavers are foraging and kind of changing and modifying habitats. So again, this is a really good paper. And what we're starting to see, and these are Scottish examples now, that really after kind of 15, 20 years, we're having these really, lovely, I think, diverse beaver generated habitats. That are starting to mature and kind of, again, provide lots of different niches for other species. So, things like flooded dead standing wood, that's quite a rare habitat in Britain these days. If you go to parts of Poland or Germany, you can see these kind of mature beaver landscapes where you see lots of dead standing wood. And again, I think it's quite recognized, dead woods in our system is maybe something that's been a bit lacking. And here's the species that comes back and kind of, puts this injection of some of these lost habitats back in again. We can see them modifying shorelines, making them more diverse, more complex, creating all these kind of micro habitats for a whole range of other species. In beaver ponds, we can see, the slowing down of water is generating a whole host of different aquatic invertebrates, amphibians, and loads of more insect life. And then you can see the bat and birds kind of, coming into these kind of habitats. Again, the dam on the left there, we had cameras over that dam for a couple of weeks, and you can see all these other species using it and as pathways through a wetland, or herons sitting fishing off them. We've got pine martens passing through, badgers, red squirrels, everything kind of using these networks. So again, lots of biodiversity benefits. This is an example from a forestry commission land, again up in Scotland. So you can see the picture there, tiny stream or burn going through it, an area of clear fell forestry. So if you watch the kind of date, beavers move in, and no prizes for where the beavers are. But again, you can just see from what was quite a narrow kind of stream, multiple kind of dams, really creating open water, so new kind of wetland habitat that wasn't there before. And again, you're walking through these landscapes full of things like now kingfishers, lots of fish moving through the system, amphibians. So again, if we as humans are prepared to give beavers space to make these changes, then, you know, in a number of years, a lot of things, as I guess the conservation sector we're trying to recreate, is pretty much done by a pair of beavers. So again, it all comes down to space and I guess our tolerance as humans, and if we can allow these changes to take place. Again, this is, I think, probably quite a famous image now from an estate in Devon. So a farming estate, lots of cattle and some arable as well. So, you know, as we were kind of appreciating, we're having more drought events. So this was a summer a few years ago. So the beaver habitat is on the right. Again, they've dammed a kind of small stream, made it more complex, holding much more water on the landscape. So it's not just about open water, they're also kind of storing or recharging, you know, a lot of the underground kind of water storage. So, you know, I guess the image speaks for itself. This flush of green remained all through the drought period, where just outside the beaver territory, obviously the crops and other plants were not so well watered, shall we say. And again, this is another example from Devon. So the image on the right is actually an enclosed pair of beavers. So if you work from kind of top to bottom, what you can see is, you know, the original small stream running through a patch of kind of upland surrounded by cattle farming. The beavers, and if you look at the dates on the left-hand side, so the beavers went in 2011, and by the next year, all the dark vertical lines, those are new dams being created. And then the shading in pink is areas of open water behind it. So pretty fast, they modified this stream system. And again, they weren't huge dams, but there was multiple dams. And again, you can see how it changes over the years. So what went in as a kind of straight, you know, water running off pretty fast system was then changed into this much more complex, you know, areas of both open water, but, you know, marsh system as well. Again, just lots of kind of modifications, not just of plants, but increase in plants diversity and a kind of change in the animal species then occupying that. But I think the take-home message was the image on the left, so the water quality going in to the enclosure started off on the left, and by the time it came out, it was that color. So even without kind of thinking about it too much, you can see by the time the water traveled through all the dams, a lot of the suspended particles were obviously taken out of it. But backed onto that, the chemical analysis, you could see a reduction in nitrate phosphate levels as well. So this is why people are kind of getting excited by what beavers can bring. This is a very short video. Hopefully you can hear it. Again, we talk about beavers, you know, having the potential to reconnect floodplains, to restore some of our habitats. So hopefully this wee animation, you don't have to listen to me for 2 minutes, explains all that.
So how can beavers play a role in restoring an incised stream? With their innate urge to build, beavers will dam narrow trenches during low flows. During high flows, these dams can wash out, which then helps to widen the trench, allowing a floodplain to begin to form. As the stream widens, the flow slows, allowing beavers to build wider, more stable dams. As the dams begin to trap sediment, this provides nutrients for vegetation, and as they begin to establish, the water table rises, allowing the stream to reconnect to its former floodplain. Eventually, a complex habitat of beaver dams, live vegetation, and dead wood slow the flow even further, raising the ground level and creating a more resilient habitat that is much wetter and better able to cope with extremes in weather and temperature.
That was also just a wee excuse to show off that Joanna Lumley did that for us, so I'll plug that as well. So given all those kind of, you know, thinking about why we're bringing back, you know, the species and kind of some of those reasons, just to say the picture today now with Eurasian beaver looks like this. So marked in orange is the current distribution of the species, again, in its European capacity. So I guess, sorry, in black are those relic populations that we, you know, saw marked in yellow a few slides ago. So I think just to kind of hopefully kind of convince you that when it comes to Britain, we're kind of one of the last kind of European states to really actively restore this species. So it's recovered, across its range in Europe, both by protection and kind of natural colonization from some of those relic populations. But most of this picture today is made up of proactive translocations of this species. So again, we're seeing quite a different picture in Europe. And again, we've got lots of communications with managers in Europe and really trying to learn from them as how do you kind of deal with this species and mitigate some of its impacts as well. So just thinking about the ecology and where you find beavers, I would basically say any freshwater system, don't rule it out. They're a highly adaptable species, and yes, you'll read in textbooks they prefer slow-moving water, lots of woodland and forest about them, but as I say, highly adaptive. So the picture on the right-hand corner is pretty much most common habitat that we deal with beavers. And again, it's these agricultural systems that they can readily adapt to, absolutely no problem at all. Now, with that brings its challenges, which I'll go on with, but basically just to really paint the picture that beavers can survive in a lot of conditions. They're not a wilderness species. They're living in kind of downtown urban areas, right through to all sorts of watercourse or different hydrological kind of compositions, from lakes to small streams to big deep rivers. And again, just to give you an example, this is one site worked with a few years ago, and the water in the left-hand picture is not about half a meter deep. It's maybe 2 meters wide if there's rain. But if you look at the picture on the right, almost in the distance at the end of the stubble field, you can see kind of like a green line. That's the burn. So the beavers are living in that. We trapped a family of 7 in that burn. So no trees around, or very few trees around. The picture on the left is their lodge. And like I say, family of 7, all really good weights, living there for many years. And again, totally adapted to these kind of landscapes. So where are we in Britain? So this map, just to kind of note, it's the catchments are coloured in. So this is not the extent of beaver spread, if you know what I mean. But just to kind of demonstrate, there's definitely a clustering going on in south, east and southwest of England. And then in Scotland, we've probably got the largest wild populations up there. Most of the beavers living in, well, maybe not most, a lot of beavers living in England are in enclosed projects. So it's estimated there's about 50 of these now. Wales, lesser extent. But the picture of how we've got to wild beavers today in Britain really is a combination of some licensed releases, mostly wild ones taking place in Scotland, but also, it's noted there has been unsanctioned releases of this species as well, and that's why we have clusters of some of these populations, especially in Cornwall and Devon and over in Kent. So it's a mixed bag of where we are today. Now, after many years, beavers are now protected as a European protected species. That comes on mainly through the Habs Reg, but also under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Other laws might come into play as well. So think about Wild Mammal Act, but also the Animal Welfare Act as well. Now, this has taken place at different times. In Scotland, it became protected in 2019, and in England, it was 2022 they've become protected. So that means there's now a kind of licensing framework if you want to do anything in and around beavers. So we'll talk a wee bit about that. Basically, obviously the animals themselves are protected, but just a note that some of their features and activities, kind of what they build, for example, are also protected as well, just to kind of keep everyone right. So that means their shelter features that can be burrows or lodges. Their dams are also protected if they're over 2 weeks of age. So that's considered protected because they need, and they're not all beavers dam, but when they do dam, they need the dams to kind of keep the water levels regulated around shelter features such as lodges and burrows. So that's why the dams are protected as well. They're treated as a resting site. It also means, unless you've got a license, you can't be kind of trapping, disturbing or releasing beavers without a license. There's also what we call a kit dependency period, which means there's kind of more protection given during these periods, which change in Scotland and England. And that's just a time when the kits are very smaller in the lodges. So think about those as well. So we'll come back to kind of licensing and what you can and can't do. but just to kind of discuss some of the beaver field signs. Now, of course, there's no prizes for these. Some beaver field signs are really obvious. They're not going to be anything else. So things like felled trees, for example, lodges and dams are probably the key kind of features that are easy to see. And there's little else you can kind of, mistake them for. However, a lot of beaver field signs, especially at low densities or especially kind of during the summer periods, can be really actually subtle for such a big animal on our landscapes. And often, wild beaver populations have been building up kind of almost unnoticed until they get into much higher density and start leaving more of the distinct signs as they settle down. Beavers also do a bit of a diet shift during the summer, so they'll eat a lot of the green vegetation and leave very few kind of woody field signs, as we call them. So again, like I say, if you're looking for beaver activity, we typically wait until the later months when all the kind of bankside vegetation dies down, and then you can kind of really get a better handle on where the beavers are maybe as well. But again, they're a creature of habit, so you can quite easily watch beavers and kind of follow a family as well. So it's just to kind of look out for some of the more subtle signs. Now, obviously, we can't have or talk about beavers as these kind of drivers of landscape change without obviously addressing some of the issues that they can bring. Now, beavers can obviously act very differently on different catchments. They'll act differently over time or different population densities. But a lot of my day-to-day is working largely with landowner community to try and mitigate beaver impacts. So they can be things like direct crop foraging. So the middle picture there, that's in the middle is the silver is one of our traps. So you can see, again, creatures of habit coming up and down, and they will basically exploit any kind of food opportunities. They're 100% vegetarian, but there's very little species I've come across that they won't have a go at. So they'll utilize whatever's kind of around them, and that can be crops, bankside vegetation, and a whole range of kind of, as they move into people's gardens, for example, we can see there's not really many species they won't have a go at. They definitely have their preferences, though. They're obviously big animals and they have to live obviously in the banks or, creating burrows. Now, these can, undermine features. There's a lot of concern about beavers and flood banks, for example. And just, I think their burrowing capacity is often underestimated, and that is a growing challenge as well. And again, like I say, not all beaver families will dam, but where they dam can obviously very much impact if it's an issue or not. And sometimes it's not even the dam structure itself or the impounded water that they're holding back. It can be, what's happening around the dam. So there can be issues up and downstream as well. So we really have to kind of work out what those issues are and how we can mitigate against them. Beavers, like I say, creatures of habit. Sometimes they've been attempting to join water bodies together, and even if it's not direct digging, but just you imagine a heavy, wet animal going back and forth, they can lead to erosion trails as well. And again, where dams are will really determine if there's an impact or not. So before we kind of think about, whether you have to have a license or whatever, the mitigation frameworks in both Scotland and England actually allow you to do quite a bit without a license. And largely because it's recognised by the authorities, these animals are going to have an impact. And, the quicker people can either get involved if it's likely to be an issue and intervene, this can kind of help over the long term. So, for example, by that, I mean, if there's sections of a watercourse, for example, that no dams could ever be tolerated or no water changes could ever be tolerated, the power lies with the landowner as well. So dams under 2 weeks of age can be removed without a license, for example. You can go about, if beavers kind of move in on your land, you can go about all your kind of normal land management practices, as long as you're directly not interfering with things like lodges, for example. So if you were felling trees, for example, or ploughing a field and, beavers just happen to be, living in the kind of drainage ditch next to you, all those can go ahead without a license. Beaver canals, for example, can be infilled. So there's actually hopefully a lot of power that you can do before you have to even think about getting a license. But as I mentioned, they're now quite highly protected. So the three main reasons that kind of enables you to get or proceed with a license process or not, these tests must be met before you can kind of apply, or before your license is considered. So things like you have to have a purpose to apply for a beaver license, which makes sense. Now, the purposes are usually one of three. It's you need to do an action to protect another species of conservation value. So, for example, that might mean salmon passage through a dam, for example. The main reason why licenses are given out is if there's a direct significant impact on things like property or crop or livestock, or also in the name of kind of public health. So, for example, if beavers were at risk of undermining a road or damming, holding water up against a railway embankment, those kind of reasons, such as those. The second kind of test is you have to kind of, at least think about, is there any other approach? Now, this is how this is implemented is you work through a 5-step approach, which I'm going to come on to after. So what that really is, it's a mitigation hierarchy. So for example, you're asked to work through your mitigation options that will start from kind of doing nothing right through to, in theory, lethal control. So you couldn't start at lethal control. You might have to demonstrate to go, look, there's no other option for me to live alongside this, or, the dam has to come out. So I'll work through that. I probably don't explain that well, but I'll work through that when I show you the 5-step approach. The third test is that as a species, they remain in favourable conservation status. So that just means, are there enough beavers around, and does your mitigation, is it ever likely to impact at a population level? So, for example, in Scotland, beavers are seen as in favourable conservation status. There's enough, which means, other higher level mitigation can be undertaken. Just to flag up, even when you get your beaver license, just be very mindful there'll be other permits, other regulations that you'll have to work to as well. So, for example, if you had a beaver license to take out a really old established dam, and the sudden release or taking down of that dam, released loads of sediment that covered salmon spawning grounds below, you would have to work through SAFA as well, if that makes sense. So just be mindful of that. So the 5-step approach, and this is the way Natural England are encouraging people to look at when you want to mitigate against beaver impacts. So you start at the top, do nothing, and adapt is how it's worded. So that means really consider, do you have to intervene? Sometimes when we do mitigate, it kind of spirals off and causes other impacts. So can you live with the changes? Are you meeting the 3 tests? Are there significant impacts? So it's to think about that. The next step they ask you to look at, can you make space for water? So I think this image speaks for itself. Where we see anywhere we can have more naturalized buffers, and I totally appreciate that's not always possible, but most beaver activity acts across the first kind of, from the water to the first 20 meters. And what we find, even if we do nothing, as in if the banks are covered with brambles or some shrubs, most of the beaver impacts just aren't realized. When the banks are kind of more stripped or bare and easily dug into, that's where we get the most significant beaver impacts. The next action is, what can you do without a license? And that's what I kind of showed you before. So can you work through and mitigate without needing a license? Then you start to think about, do you need a license? So in England, there's a class license system for beavers. So CL52, for example, you can pretty much, phone up, contact Natural England and say, look, I need to do some burrow or light dam mitigation outside of the breeding season. And that would cover that. So lower impact license includes dam management, maybe putting in a flow device, protecting a culvert, that kind of thing, or filling in a burrow. The higher level licenses are if you wanted to do these activities such as fill in a lodge, for example, during the kit dependency period. So you'd have to kind of justify that a bit more. And the CL50s are kind of trap and removal of beavers. So it would be kind of more specialists or organisations, such as ourselves, for example, would hold those licenses, and if it was deemed that beavers would have to be removed, for example. So as a last resort, and this really is in Scotland right now, it will come through in England, but right now this is kind of my day-to-day as well. So we would trap as a last resort method. In parts of Scotland, under kind of significant conditions, lethal control licenses are available. So we work with landowners to offer a kind of alternative to trapping. And, you know, that's where you kind of see a lot of these kind of release projects have been animals that we've translocated under certain circumstances and under license in Scotland. So to do that, though, it takes a lot of time and resources. We bring in all the animals. We've got special beaver holding facilities. We do a lot of disease screening, a lot of testing, and make sure they're fit for release. We always try and move families together because that's usually more successful, and make sure, like I say, they're in good condition. And then licenses come in. So our release options are typically either wild releases in Scotland, enclosed beaver projects in England, and then you'll see more recently wild release licenses are starting to be talked about in England. So typically, like I say, most beavers currently that are moved to England are going into enclosures. So you can see these are really quite big enclosures. They have to be fenced, and they're quite robust fencing. It's quite expensive. But people, again, are I guess, really keen to see these species back or demonstrate what they can do in different landscapes. So some of these enclosures, absolutely stunning. And the beavers are really kind of demonstrating what they could look like on the larger kind of landscape. And a lot of science has been generated, which is really kind of demonstrating in a British context, things like water quality, storage, drought resistance, and all these kind of concepts that we've kind of promoted that beavers could bring back. Again, a big part of what we do is talking about, can we make space for water? Can we make space for beavers? That brings all these other benefits. It's not only just about the beavers and creating kind of habitat for them, but it's really kind of hopefully, helping us all collectively develop more resilient landscapes. We think about sediment retention, holding soil back, and again, creating these kind of buffers that we can see are working kind of in drought resilience, but also wildfire breaks. So there's a lot of work in America where actually, wildfires are kind of ripping through, and it's the beaver ponds are actually acting as buffers to some of these kind of catastrophic kind of events for wildlife and property as well. So there's a lot of work going on that. Just to mention, I'll definitely not go through all of these. There are some funding sources now available, definitely more in England than there are in Scotland, that could be used for beaver mitigation. So, for example, there's a couple of countryside steward payment schemes, but also some of these, other funding sources could be used to kind of help create these buffers next to watercourses, not for beavers per se, but what it helps is kind of create these habitats that we can see are definitely reducing some of the beaver conflicts, and obviously have other benefits as well. I can provide these slides after, obviously, but the question was, well, what do you do now if you see a beaver? As we can see, they are moving through our landscapes. Some of the wild populations are obviously expanding. And there's probably not too many catchments, especially in the south of England, that beavers may get to eventually. So yes, there's proposals by different organisations to see some wild release in certain areas. But I would also say, even if beavers aren't being released, immediately in the vicinity, they are definitely moving large distances in our landscape. They're quite a mobile species as long as they can kind of follow the water. So again, there's starting to be lots of information out there, and happy for feedback as well. But Natural England, EA have dedicated websites, that really hopefully talk you through the license process and when you would be thinking about intervening or not if you have to. But also, some of these opportunities of having beavers back in our landscape, and we're always a sounding board. That can help with potential conflicts, but also, if people are interested in beavers and want to know further information. So I'm just checking the time. I'm just going to kind of finish up a bit of a kind of conclusion here. So hopefully I've introduced you, you probably know already, but to the species. The good thing I think about beavers is they're creatures of habit. They leave these kind of distinct field signs, so we can get a lot of information just looking about their kind of biology, ecology, and how they use their landscape. So in a way, they're quite predictable. In a way, I would never underestimate a beaver. What we see, they're highly adaptive. And sometimes we get calls like, well, is it a beaver? Would it really turn up here? And I would say 9 times out of 10, yeah, it probably would. It doesn't mean it's always trying to settle down, but we can see, they can disperse quite widely in the landscape, and kind of really get to places where they may or may not be able to stay, but they are quite mobile. Obviously, like any animal, they need food, but just to say their diet is really wide. So again, don't underestimate what they can utilize. So we have them living in areas that have barely any trees, because Britain doesn't present a very challenging climate for beavers. They're built, for the tundra, or, going up into Scandinavia and the north of Canada. So they can survive, a long time in lots of snow with very little food about. So that's why they do kind of have this capacity to live on trees if they have to. And of course they fell them to build as well. But, we're having, big beaver families that are living with very few trees around. So don't feel the tree line is restricting where they can and can't be. Obviously, they need to have shelter for themselves. Now, this can be the typical lodge, the kind of textbook, pointy lodge, but a lot of beavers are living in burrows, and that's, I would say, an underreported and underestimated shelter where they can be. And I think sometimes people are kind of minded to look for lodges, or if they don't see a lodge, they might presume they might not have beavers, but not all beavers will build lodges. So they can be quite tucked away and discreet in deeper banks, and you may never know if the burrows are there. Obviously, they're very tied to this freshwater kind of interface. And yeah, given the choice, they probably do prefer slightly deeper water, slower moving. But you will have beavers living in the narrowest of water courses, not that deep, or some really fast flowing kind of rocky rivers as well. And this changes as their kind of population density changes. So the first kind of colonizers will always pick the best habitat that ticks all the boxes. But as their population kind of increases, new animals are kind of forced out into, well, we call it suboptimal habitat. But being a beaver, you can change it. So if the water isn't quite deep enough, you can make it a bit deeper. If you can't burrow back into the banks, then you can build upwards and build yourself a lodge and make sure you've got shelter. Like I say, highly mobile, large distances. So undoubtedly, people have taken beaver movement into their own hands and kind of moved them about, especially historically. But just to not underestimate, I mean, we've, trapped and tagged animals, and they've moved easily 40, 50 kilometers just following a river and turned up, a month or two later. So you're really mobile, looking for new homes and partners to settle down. Again, yes, creatures of habit, they do similar behaviours, but each catchment and each site is very different. So not all beavers will obviously behave the same. And again, impacts can be subjective, they can change over time. So again, it's something to think about. Beavers moving into an area doesn't always mean X, Y, and Z, but I'd say they're a creature that never fails to surprise me, and every kind of site is different, and families will behave slightly differently. So sometimes I always say it's better the beaver family so you can kind of predict what they're doing quite a lot. And once we start interfering, such as trapping or mitigating with the dam and stuff, they can react very differently. And sometimes you can just trigger this whole series of other impacts as well. So we always think carefully of when we do intervene. Their territorial nature, there's nothing better than a resident beaver family to keep away other beavers. So like I say, if we start trapping or if lethal controls kind of implemented, it kind of splits up the family as well. So you can kind of have, instead of that family holding that space, sometimes it just triggers this wave of kind of dispersers moving in, and each of them can, start burrowing or build different dams. So, and it also kind of increases how many beavers you might have on your landscape, because you don't have these big resident families kind of kicking out and keeping other beavers away. In England, you will have the Natural England Licensing Framework. Hopefully I explained the 5-step approach without making it overcomplicated, but it's just, I would say it's just a mindset that you kind of work your way through and see what the best approach is. And that, again, that is because it is protected at the minute. So again, you just have to think about can you always take the less interventionist approach, for example? And if you can't, then the licensing system is there for you to apply, and help is usually available from Natural England themselves, or as we know, there's more and more beaver management groups in the areas where beavers are either being released or have been for a long time. So there's lots of different sources of information. Overall, I guess there's quite nothing quite like a beaver, but the landscape impacts that beavers can make shouldn't be underestimated. There's lots of positivity, there's lots of kind of biodiversity, these natural ecological services they will provide, and they really can be, demonstrate these exciting changes that we are seeing already in a British context are helping us develop more resilient landscapes. But again, as I say, they're creatures that do modify the habitat, and it will be down to human tolerance and what we can accept as well. So there's a huge social factor in beavers, and what we mitigate and where they will be tolerated as well. So I'm going to just finish there and say thank you so much for listening. Hope it was of interest, and happy to take questions, and I'll try to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Roisin. That was absolutely fascinating. Really, really interesting. So thanks so much. We've got a few questions in the Q&A in the chat, but I'll give people a bit more time to think of some questions while I ask you a couple of questions first. What is the genetic diversity of different beaver populations in the whole of the UK like? And is that something that you have to take into quite careful consideration when you're, for example, you're mentioning that a lot of your work is to do with trapping beavers as part of licensing or licensing requirements. How does sort of genetic diversity of populations play into that at all?
Yeah. Great question. So beavers as a species have gone for a huge bottleneck. Like I said, they went down to such few numbers. So a lot of today's populations have recovered from really small numbers, and Britain's no difference there. We actively, like I say, we take blood samples. So there's some large genetic studies going on with Natural England at the minute. But what we also do is we manage a stud book. So it's like a zoo kind of conservation tool. So every beaver we move and families, we have a picture of at least who's related to who. So if we don't, know the actual genetic diversity, results, we know who's related. So when we are moving them to enclosures or moving animals between enclosed projects, we make sure we look at their trapping location and make them as kind of geographically far apart as possible. So it's an analysis tool of who is most likely to be least related, if you know what I mean. Now going forward, there are talk about, well, do we import and kind of, inject more genetic material later on? The thing is, beavers as a whole, as a species, are so much more genetically reduced than they were, when they were much more common. So, I would say, fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of our beavers we can see in Britain are from Bavaria. And now Bavaria did an active reintroduction, a few decades ago, where they literally took, some beavers from France, from Norway, Russia, and they purposely mixed them. So actually what we've got in Britain is a result of that, so a quite mixed population to start with. But also we can see in the genetic records as well that, there's been Polish animals brought in or Norwegian animals brought in. So there's something like 5 distinct genetic clades in Europe. And in Britain so far, we found 4 of them. So by, I would say, pure accident, we actually have an okay genetic mix to start with. But what's really important is we have to make sure they don't inbreed as far as possible. So when we're starting founder populations for release, we make sure we're taking them from other parts of Britain and mixing things up as far as possible.
That's really interesting. And when you're releasing those beavers that you've trapped, or beaver families that you've trapped and are relocating elsewhere, is there ongoing monitoring of those populations to see how they get on? Is that part of the licensing requirements?
So most of those, like I say, today have been in Scotland. So it's, at a catchment scale. So making sure you're putting enough animals in. So the licensing would be, talking about, 15 pairs or families to start a new catchment. So it's that kind of scale, if that makes sense. And like I say, we're very careful of our where we trap them from, and make sure we're putting in as much mix at the start. But these are projects that apply and go through the process, so it becomes kind of their obligation to monitor them, but also work with the local communities and make sure people are kind of trained up in mitigation as well. So I guess we're a bit luckier in Scotland, we're a bit further down the line. So there's been some kind of funding for those kind of stuff. And yeah, I say monitoring is a big part of that. I would say it's all going to come to England quite shortly. There has been one wild release I mean, there's the wild projects in Otter, in the River Otter, but the kind of new wild release was in Purbeck. So that was quite a small number of animals released. But as you know, there's lots of applications being processed at the minute that might result in larger projects emerging in the next few years. But those projects are pretty much you have to demonstrate that you have staff, resources, that you've public engagement, you've got mitigation plans, but they're committed to almost 10 years of doing that as well. So it's actually quite a lot of obligation to try and release beavers.
Yeah, I didn't realize that at all, actually. So that's really interesting to hear, that it's not, you don't just apply for a license to release them and then you forget about them. You have to commit to actually kind of making sure they're not up to no good. That's really interesting. Okay, well I'll stop hogging the questions now, and I'll ask some in the Q&A in the chat. The first question was from Rosie Smithson. Are there any species that lose out due to change in habitat by beavers?
I would say yes, undoubtedly, but I think it's more the change in the system now. Again, that's something that we're monitoring, and other organisations and universities especially. I guess we're not seeing significant impacts, but theoretically, I would say those slower moving species. So there are concerns about pearl mussels, for example, things like lichen. Again, I say we're not seeing it as yet, but there's lots of concerns if that is going to be an area that we'd have to take more action, or when you're applying for release licenses, you have to look at other protected species and demonstrate impacts, or how you're going to monitor and mitigate against that. So I would say those are probably the main ones. So those animals or plant species that can't move fast, because if you think about beavers and water level changes, that can happen quite rapidly actually, or dams can appear quite rapidly. So you're changing almost like a flowing system into a more kind of slower one with higher sediment. You think about sediment trapped behind a dam. So yeah, there are concerns about that. And again, lots of interest in monitoring it. We haven't seen it yet, but I'm not saying it couldn't happen.
Brilliant. Next question. When we hear about beaver bombing, so the unsanctioned releases, they're often of single beavers, not entire families. Presumably this isn't good for the beaver being released, or the local area. The question is, who are the people doing this? And where do they get the beavers? Do they import them?
So we've worked really hard. I think there was a lot of concern that beavers were being imported. So I guess, you all know better than me, the latest changes. We're fairly convinced there hasn't been imports for a long time, and that would be difficult. But I mean, if you could imagine, there's been collections of beavers before you needed licenses to keep them. There's been escapees. We can see, some from a couple of decades now. So I think I would presume, and again, we're trying to work quite closely, that beaver bombing are coming from wild populations or enclosed populations that may be predated, potentially some of the licensing or escapees, and those are animals being moved around rather than imports. Now, we've done a lot of work over the past 15 years for disease screening, because there's always the risk, if there's animals from unknown origin that no one can either identify or take credit for. We have to spend, and again we've done it in Scotland and England, a lot of time trapping up these animals, with Natural England, Nature Scot, testing them just to be sure that there's not diseases or parasites of concern. And to be honest, that it hasn't helped the cause, so to speak, when beavers disappear. There's there can be challenges with, if the local community can accept them or not. Are they protected or not? So there's been lots of kind of challenges around that. And what I would say is, like, we've tried very hard to improve beaver welfare, which is why, we work to moving the family together and that kind of stuff. So I guess we do, like I say, loads of disease screening. So I would say maybe some of those factors aren't thought about in some of these actions as well. But obviously it's been successful, and new populations are emerging that have not been officially sanctioned. So not best practice at all, and definitely don't condone it. Yeah, it's a really hard one to police as well, I think, because people are excited about beavers. I guess people always want to challenge authority as well. So, like I say, we spent a lot of time and money trying to make sure at least the disease aspect has been covered, and there's not silly risks like taking animals from the continent and just bringing them in without any disease screening.
There's just been a follow-up question to that one. Do we have any data on whether those kind of single releases or unsanctioned releases have survived? And is it possible that the population is much higher than we think it is?
Oh, undoubtedly, I think it's higher than we think it is. So again, we've done a lot of surveys. If we're kind of commissioned, like looking at Kent and kind of trying to estimate. But we can see beavers are moving through the landscape. Are the singletons successful? I mean, I don't know if there's any way of us ever knowing that for certain for every individual. But they're definitely meeting each other on a landscape. You can definitely see breeding and distribution, expansion. So enough of them are definitely surviving to kind of create these pockets of populations. So yeah. And like I say, beavers will move long distances as well. So their sense of smell is brilliant. So they will go out and seek each other. So yeah, I think as long as it's connected, they're finding each other in places.
I suppose another potential problem with the unsanctioned releases is that you and your organisation work so hard, you're saying, to maintain genetic diversity and not and avoid inbreeding, but that's obviously something that is potentially uncontrolled with this as well. So that's just and with the
sorry, I was just going to say, animal welfare, would be our priority in this. So, I mean, there's lots of different views there, isn't there? And people are like, well, it's worked, hasn't it? We've got beavers back. And I'd like to hope people are taking responsibility, but there's no way of knowing. So we can see beavers are still a prey species in their head. So yeah, they're big, robust, and they're tough. But they'll be like a lot of prey species, like I'm fine, and then I'll keel over. Do you know what I mean? So they don't show this a lot. So I think that's led to a bit of oh, beavers are fine. You know what I mean? And we can see there's personality traits. There's I mean, not to be emotional, but we can see they're scared or, that kind of stuff. So that's why we have a really hands-off approach as far as possible. So we're trying to keep them as calm, undisturbed as possible when they're in kind of quarantine with us as well, because they do react and they do get highly stressed. And you can see kind of knock-on consequences of that as well.
Another question in the Q&A. At a water management board meeting, when asked about beavers being introduced to impact positively on flooding, our expensive willow plantations were considered to be a problem. Is it?
I don't know why with that. What? Sorry, I'm lost in the question. Is that because?
I think the question's asking. No, sorry. I think the question's asking. What impact potentially could beavers be having on plantations of trees that people want to keep there? But raise your hand, Rosie, if I've got that incorrect, and I can unmute you, and you can elaborate yourself. Yeah, I think it must have just been about the potential impact of beavers on planted trees and habitat that people don't want to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I mean, it depends, I guess, what what the willow's for. Obviously, willow's one of the most robust plants that has definitely evolved around with beavers. So actually, you know, when beavers feed on willow, we're going to see it almost kind of makes it more productive and sends off more, you know, coppices really well, sends off loads more side stream stems. So it really depends, I guess, what you're using the willow for. It's one of the least plants we would worry about, not because we don't care, but because it's so robust. What we're also working on is woodland creation in areas of beavers. And, you know, that I guess has been a bit harder to kind of convince people that you can do that in beaver presence. You know, because there's, I guess, a lot of perception is, well, what's the point in planting trees? There won't be any left. So we're working with kind of forestry research and some of the woodland kind of plantation schemes, you know, really looking at what species we put out there, planting density, and we're also trialing things like willow buffers, you know, really dense planting willow along the kind of shoreline. And I won't say does that stop beavers, because they'll definitely have preferences and kind of, you know, one day they'll march 60 meters to get an apple tree or something. So there's different motivations, but again, it's just finding ways that we can either, you know, reduce their impacts, again, by regenerating willow. You know, that's a good way to kind of make sure the root bulbs in the ground, the bank's stable, and you always have kind of that greenery. So they will munch on it, but they can't take it all. And then the kind of, so that's almost falls into kind of the making space for beavers kind of category. But where we've had to, you know, and especially expensive or established plantations, that's where we've looked to kind of fence off if it's practical. So you can always do individual tree guards, but if it's plantations, you know, we put longer layer, you know, lengths of mesh fencing in. Now, obviously, you can't always do that by the water course as well, if it's a flood risk, etc. But again, we're trying to find different ways and approaches to do that. But what we find, even allowing your banks to scrub up, you know, with brambles, nettle, you know, everything else, beavers will be foraging in on them as well. So like I say, if the banks are quite, I guess, manicured and it's only a few single mature trees, then, you know, the impacts of beavers absolutely look drastic. And that's where we start to look at selective individual tree protection. So I guess it's managing people's expectations, but trying to find a range of solutions as well. And I guess it comes back to, you know, collectively as society, what do we want our riverbanks to look like as well? And do we have capacity to kind of let them naturalize as well? And sometimes we can, sometimes we can't.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it applies to so many other parts of wildlife conservation as well, doesn't it? It's just about, you know, where we can, allowing things to get scrubby, to look a little bit, quote, messy. You know, it's getting used to those sort of changing aesthetics as well, which I think sometimes is half the battle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, next question. What is the range of reactions from farmers and landowners that you encounter? And a sort of follow up to that, have you noticed changing attitudes over time?
Yep, good question. I would say the range, you can imagine it's everything from extreme anger to, you know, that's a good question, because, you know, sometimes, you know, I guess we're all guilty of going, oh, well, the farmers say that, and that's not the case. I find that it's very diverse. And I think there's other social factors in play as well. So some are really annoyed, angry, and will never see that this was a good thing. And, you know, that's fine. People can have their views, but I would say that's probably the minority. But they can be very vocal, that sector. Then I think you've got the other extreme where people are like, absolutely, burn it on, all the rest of it. So the middle ground is, I wouldn't say indifference, it's concern, but it's getting to me more manageable concern. You know, a lot of conversations are kind of like, look, I don't care if they're down, that area kind of floods, or that's the scrubby willow part. I don't care about that part. But if they move on to this part, then we're going to have issues. So I think there's definitely a wider understanding that it's a species coming back, that there's also that kind of public pressure as well. So some people don't want to be seen to be kind of negative against beavers as well. And there is concern about, you know, if beavers move in, do I get the, you know, the bloody beaver people and that kind of stuff. But I would say over the years, you know, I've been out to some of the same farms for going on 10, 12 years. No way is everyone convinced, but I think there's this transition as the beaver kind of landscape matures. So what I mean by that is, you know, when beavers first move in, it can look, people say it's terrible. I have no trees left. Look what they've cut down in 3 months, 6 months. I'm going to have no trees. And then you can go back to that same site. Yes, trees have fallen over. It's definitely more messy. But things have coppiced, things have kind of greened up. So you don't see the same visual impacts as when they first move in. So I think there's a slow kind of learning to live with that. But the big targeted impacts, things like flood banks or, repeatedly taking out dams in heavily managed or drained land. I mean, that's really challenging. And I think land managers collectively need a bit more support with that as well. And I think society needs to kind of, think as well. We can realize the benefits of beavers at kind of society level, if you know what I mean. But the costs are definitely going to be on individual landowners. And I think we need to kind of balance that up a little more as well. And I think that's where some of maybe the polarization is coming from as well.
That's really, really interesting. And it sort of brings me on to the next question. Can we learn anything from other European countries about how we manage conflicts between beavers and landowners, or whether they have compensation schemes in place for farmers and landowners affected by flooding, for example? Are there any examples of countries who are doing really well and that we can sort of look to as an example?
I'm laughing because, I asked a similar questions to some of the German managers, and they're like, yeah, after about 40 years, people stopped being so angry. I was like, okay, that's still a while. So I think, compensation is one that kind of goes back and forth. There's, in parts of Germany, there is, I guess compensation, but it's slightly more complicated, as in, the first kind of 2 meters of a kind of bank is owned by the government, if you know what I mean. So then if beavers kind of impact beyond that, and it's not huge, but you can kind of get payments for crop impact kind of thing as well. I think in other countries that have either always had beavers or have them in larger densities, I mean, lethal control does come into it. And again, there's almost a tipping point in density as well. So I think if we're going to live with beavers, I'm not saying definitely it's rush out and lethal control is the answer, because I don't think it is, as in we just create vacant territories. But anyway, so I just think there's probably a point and a realism that, if we see this species back in large numbers and densities, it's just not going to be tolerated everywhere. But with that, I think I'd like to see, well, where beavers are definitely, have lower conflict catchments or something, I think we should really think about, implementing them and seeing and encouraging people to kind of not be more tolerant, but, think about wider impacts of, like you say, messy landscapes, think about drought, think about, our soils running off our land, think about more wetlands being needed in the system. So I think there's a good balance in there somewhere, where I think beavers can be larger numbers and more widely on our landscapes, but we need a more robust management program that works. And part of that is not just about lethal control, but it's about, educating people, taking some of the fear factor out of what beavers will or won't do. But then where there are absolute issues, let's allow people and facilitate people to manage them, and whether that's dam removal or whatever, without sometimes penalizing them. And that can be like social pressure as well. So, sometimes a lot of our conflicts are sometimes, with the real pro extreme people that are watching people like, oh, you touched that dam, and that kind of social I guess polarization is not helping either kind of cause, if that makes sense. So I think we need to take some of that out and not demonize people that just can't live with water level changes in kind of very flat arable levels, for example. We can't expect beavers to be everywhere. So is there any country that does it? I don't think any country does it 100% right, but I think over time it's easier to mitigate. But again, it takes resources, and some of these countries do have pots of money come from the government, and that's not quite in existence here yet. And whether that's positive payments to encourage habitats that are more resilient to the beaver presence or something like that, I think we need to think about that. And I think that's more applicable than maybe just a straight flat compensation scheme, which I think can be open or harder to police, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, sort of rewarding positive actions to encourage them to accommodate them, I suppose, in the first place. Yeah, that's really interesting. We've got another question. Can they live alongside us in cities and suburbs? And I would tag onto that. What sort of impacts have you seen, or benefits as well in those scenarios?
Oh, I'd say absolutely from a beaver point of view, yes. They'll move in regardless. It's an interesting one because definitely in urban areas, I say almost you get this polarization, but you get lots of really excitement. You get people, then groups, especially in more kind of areas of less resources, for example. There's some really good projects that Beavers has just inspired this kind of drive. People have really latched on to them, but then really started to think about, again, how they're managing their space around them. Rewilding is a word that keeps pausing, coming up. But there's definitely a positive energy around beavers in these urban environments, but also, loads of opportunities for education, interpretation, and anything from school groups to kind of kids clubs. But I'd say there's a huge positivity in that, and that it's introduced a lot more people to kind of nature as well, because it's like a big cool animal, isn't it? So people have been really excited when they turned up. On the other hand, obviously there's always two sides to everything. People have I think sometimes gone, oh yeah, that's quite cool, and then they come in and then they're in their garden, or they've taken down their favorite tree, or if they've kind of dammed at the bottom of the garden and made the the ground more wet. I've had complaints from, well, no, beavers have to go because my dog now rolls in the mud more. So there's a whole different extreme, but there's been actually really sometimes kind of neighbor on neighbor disputes. You go into kind of one street and it's like one person wants to shoot them and the other person's out there feeding them apples. So the beavers definitely can adapt to those kind of environments. They're not wilderness species at all, and they habituate to people, but it's interesting dynamics, shall I say, it's bringing out on people. And that's almost harder to mitigate against it, sometimes, because some people feel they have to police and kind of protect the beavers. But I say it's been largely positive as well, because it's really helped engage people with nature as well.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about beavers sort of still thinking that they're prey animals. What sort of species would naturally predate beavers?
So when you're a kit, you're a good package of meat. So we've had, so otter, I think, is one of the most common ones we're seeing predate on beavers. They're definitely two species that react to each other. So there's a historic memory there for sure. But like I say, people's dogs, badgers. In kind of other parts of the world, it really is wolf and bear. I mean, it's when you're a bigger beaver, it's those big carnivores, which yeah. But again, it's not enough to really control their levels, if you know what I mean. Go back to it's other beavers control beaver numbers, because if you think about it, as population density kind of increases, when you leave home, you're almost like running the gauntlet, that you have to go through several beaver territories, and they fight like mad with each other and can inflict really deep wounds. And then if you're stressed and get infected, so come around springtime when they're moving, and the back end of the year and autumn, we pick up a lot of injured beavers, or finding them dead with big wounds on each other. So they're quite they can be vicious to each other.
Yeah. And so when you said that the kits stay with their parents or their family unit for 2 years, and then they're booted out, and do their parents at that point become territorial towards them, or is it a bit gentler than that?
I think it's a bit of both, because you can see them, they make wee exploratory kind of trips, and they spend a few more days away and explore their environment. So I don't think they're always pushed, but if resources are lacking, then the parents will definitely, kick them out and kind of go on their way. But you can see they kind of come back and forth, and before they kind of take the plunge and leave completely. But then another strategy is, if there's lots of beavers around you, and it's almost dangerous for you to leave home. We see some offspring, especially in higher populations, stay at home till they're kind of 5, 7 years old. And I think it's that kind of planning for mum or dad to kind of pass away, and then you take over the family territory as well. But while you stay at home, you help mum and dad and you raise the other kids, but you don't breed yourself. So the breeding's suppressed in the offspring if they stay at home.
And have you noticed that behaviour in landscapes that are at their sort of carrying capacity more than landscapes that have Yeah.
Yeah, not here, not in Britain yet, but I've worked a lot out in Norway, where they've always had beavers and they've, been tagging them over 20, 25 years. So they kind of record every animal and ID it with a chip. So that's why we can pick up animals and you know where they're born and you're like, oh, you're still at home in your territory. So long-term studies like that are showing, again, animals 7 years old staying at home because it's such a high population density now in Norway.
Mm. We've got about 5 minutes left, so if anyone has any questions in the meantime, do pop them in the chat in the Q&A. We'll just ask Roisin, how do you, so obviously in England particularly, we've got a fair number of beaver populations in captivity and enclosures.
Yep.
How do you see those how do you see that
I don't know.
sort of developing in the long term? Obviously now wild releases are a possibility.
Yep.
We've still got some beavers in enclosures. How do
Yeah.
you see that sort of changing and evolving over time?
Yeah, well, I mean, Natural England, I've said they're minded to phase out enclosures. So I don't kind of have new ones established. But like I say, we're managing them with a stud book. So the idea is, I mean, some of these will never be wild releases, given where they are, for example. But others, these animals will be a kind of resource for future populations as well for wild releases. So that will be one option. But again, they can't just stay in enclosures forever and breed. So, it might come to a point, do you maybe sterilize these animals, let them live out the rest of their life or something? But I think this mechanism of more and more enclosed beavers, I think that's pretty much going to be phased out quite soon. And it's not our route we went down in Scotland. We've got very few enclosures. So it's just it went differently in England. So yeah.
Yeah. And do you think it would be appropriate in some of those enclosures at some point just to take the fencing down and just say, okay, we've got a beaver population or beaver enclosure here. It's in a suitable place. Let's just take the fences down.
So again, that's going to be licensed to the max. So definitely some enclosures that can be incorporated as part of a wider catchment release. So for example, applications have gone in parts of Cornwall, for example, or parts of Kent, where beavers are existing in the wild above and below them anyway. So, at some point, those fences will probably come down. But there's absolutely, if you think there's enclosures kind of in the middle of London, for example, there are probably never going to be the fences are coming down. And it's absolutely, clearly stated is just because you've got an enclosed beaver population, you may never be part of a wild release. It all depends on what catchment you're in and what the plans are for the wider catchment. So you might be one family, if you know what I mean, as part of a wider release. But yeah, doesn't guarantee any sort of wild release at all. So they're just being managed, I guess, like livestock or zoo animals going forward.
Yeah. And do you think the beaver enclosures has been a useful tool in sort of trying to get England particularly thinking, but has it been a sort of step in the path? Yeah.
I go back and forth with this one ethically because I think, I'd much prefer to see beavers out. I think they've been a useful tool in introducing people to what beavers could look like on our landscapes. It's a very false situation, isn't it? Because they're penned in. But from a science point of view, when we first talked about bringing beavers back to Scotland, it was like 16 years ago or something like that, officially. We were like, oh, there's all this evidence from Europe. And people are like, no, we have to see what they look like in a Scottish context. So and then people are like, oh, I have to see what they look like in English context. So it's been really valuable. The well-run runs, really valuable, generating science and being demonstration projects. But yeah, I think there's probably a time and a place. And hopefully we're kind of moving on to the next phase now.
Yeah, and that's really exciting, isn't it? It's yeah, I think in the UK we're very used to controlling everything and controlling our landscapes, and we're not
100%.
used at all to being inconvenienced in any way by wildlife because we've already killed everything hundreds of years ago. So I think it's a really interesting exercise in trying to get people, like you say, more connected to nature, and not just in a sort of fluffy way, I suppose.
No, practical way.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, definitely. Brilliant. Well, that brings us to time. Thank you so much, Roisin. That has been absolutely fascinating, and we really appreciate your time. So that's been really wonderful. Thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you everybody else for joining as well. It's been great to have you all on, and great to have all those questions as well. So thanks to everybody. Brilliant. Okie dokie.
Bye.